So let's get started with Ajax. And as mentioned in the beginning of this course section, Ajax and this entire idea behind this concept is all about sending HTTP requests from inside your browser-side JavaScript code. And therefore, if we want to use this Ajax concept, we first of all have to write some browser-side JavaScript code. And for this, I'll go to the public folder, since the contents of that folder are statically served and made available to the visitors of our page. And in there, I'll add a scripts folder next to the styles folder. In the scripts folder, I'll add a comments.js file because I'll write some JavaScript code, some browser-side JavaScript code that will deal with fetching and saving comments with those Ajax requests, to be precise. And since I want to start with fetching comments, let's see how that could work. For this, let's have a look at the template where I do want to fetch comments. That's the post detail EJS file. And in there, I have this load comments button, which is wrapped by a form just to ensure that a GET request is sent to this URL if this button is clicked. So this form doesn't submit any data that should be stored. That's why I'm using a GET instead of a POST request. It's only there to get a new URL when we click a button. Alternatively, we could simply use a link to this URL. That would work as well. But now I do want to change this all a little bit, and instead of using such a form, I want to add a click listener to this button, and when the button is clicked, then I want to send such an AJAX request. Therefore, as a first step, we can actually get rid of this form element here and just add the button like this. Because whilst the button now normally wouldn't do anything, we can of course add a click listener to the button with JavaScript and then write our own browser-side JavaScript logic that will be kicked off once this button is clicked. For this, we just need a way of getting access to this button, and one easy way of getting access is to add an ID to it, and for example, name this the load comments button, like this. And then in our comments.js file, which will run in the browser, we can get access to the load comments button element by using document get element by ID and passing this ID here. So this will then give us access to this button, so that as a next step, we can add an event listener to it, as we also did it many times before in this course already. And here I then want to add a click listener to then execute a function that should then actually send a request to fetch those comments. So therefore, we can add a function, fetch comments for post, could be the function name, describing what the function will do. And then here, I'll pass this function, a pointer at this function, as a second parameter value to this button. Now in here, in this function, I now do want to send such an AJAX request to my server to fetch that data, that comments data. And as I mentioned, we could do this with this XML HTTP request object, but that's a bit clunky to use. Or we add a third-party library like Axios and use that in this function then. Or we use the built-in fetch function. And I'll go for that approach. So we can call the fetch function here, even though we haven't defined it because it's built into the browser. And then the fetch function takes a string as a parameter value. And the concrete value here should be the URL to which you want to send a GET request. Because the fetch function by default sends a GET request, though you can configure it to send different kinds of requests as well. We will explore that later though. So here we'll send a GET request. Now the URL to which I do want to send a request here is in the end /, so appended to the domain of the page we're currently on, and then /posts/ the concrete post ID, we'll have to see how we get that, /comments. So I want to send a request to this path on the currently loaded domain, on the currently loaded website in the end. Now, how can we get this ID here inside of this JavaScript file? There are various ways of getting that. One rather simple yet very good way of getting the ID is to add it to this button with such a data- attribute. You might recall this special attribute. I did cover it earlier in the course when we built this tic-tac-toe game. It's an attribute that allows you to append or add arbitrary data values to any HTML element of your choice. So all HTML elements can take these data attributes. And you can then use these values which you added to HTML elements in your JavaScript code. So for example, here we could add a post ID data attribute like this with data dash and then any identifier of your choice, in this case post ID, and then simply set this equal to post._ID injected with EJS, so that the concrete post ID value is injected dynamically when this template is rendered. So once it was rendered, this will be a fixed value, but it will of course be different for different posts. And now we can extract that from the button when the button is clicked. Because in this function here, we'll automatically get an event object. We also learned about this earlier in the course already. When you trigger a function based on an event listener, JavaScript automatically gives you an event object describing the event that occurred. And in there, you, for example, get the target of the event. So in this case, the button that caused the event, like this. Though we don't even need that, of course, because we already got access to the button here through line 1. So whilst we could get access to it like this with event target, we don't even have to use this way. Instead, we can get our post ID therefore by getting access to this button, the load comments button here. And then there, we can use the dataset property to get access to all these data attributes we added. And then the identifier we chose for our data attributes. In this case, post ID. Like this. This will give us the post ID we added because I chose post ID here as an identifier after the dash. And that's how we can get the concrete post ID. And now we can add this here. And to easily inject this into the string, I'll use this template string with the backticks. We learned about that earlier in the course, where I have backticks instead of single quotes. And this still creates a regular string, but it's a string into which you can inject values like this, with this $sign curly brace syntax. So this then constructs a string which contains the post ID value. And this will then send a HTTP request to this URL. So now with that, we'll send a GET request to this URL. That already is a AJAX request, if we want to call it like this, or simply a JavaScript-driven request. A HTTP request which is invoked by our own JavaScript code. And that is a key difference to all the requests we sent before. It's now not sent automatically by the browser, and therefore the response won't automatically be handled by the browser. Instead, it's sent manually, and therefore now we as a developer also have to define the exact code that should be executed once we get a response. And that's why we're doing this, because now we'll have full control over what we do with the response. We don't automatically load a new page, we can instead just update the existing page, which is exactly what I want to do. Now, how do we do this, though? Well, as I mentioned before on the slides, the fetch function returns a promise. So therefore, we can actually add the async keyword here, as we did it multiple times before on the server side, when we worked with MongoDB or MySQL. Now I'm doing it here in the client side, in the browser side code, because there we can also use async await. It's not Node.js specific. And we can use async await whenever we're dealing with asynchronous operations that use promises, like the fetch function does here. And we can then await this response which we get eventually back. So fetch will give us a promise which will resolve to a response eventually, and that response can be stored in a constant like this. Now, in this response, we'll get a bunch of information. This response here is simply an object with a bunch of information about the response. For example, we can look into the headers, which are some metadata, some pieces of metadata that are attached. We get an OK field, which is true or false, telling us whether it's a success response or if an error occurred, and much more. For us, most importantly, we want to get the body, which is the data that was sent back by the server, though we actually don't get it in a convenient format here if we access this body field. Instead, we typically use one of the utility functions defined on this response object, so also built into the browser, which will parse the response body for us. For example, if we get back such JSON data, which is the data format commonly used, we would call the JSON function here, or the JSON method to be precise, on the response. And this would give us the extracted and already parsed response data as a JavaScript object or as JavaScript value types in general. Now, JSON doesn't give us the data like this. Instead, it actually also yields a promise, because this parsing can also take a bit longer and therefore is an asynchronous task. And hence we can also await this before we then actually get the data which we want. So the actual response data. And that then is the data which we can use in our code to continue, to then, for example, update parts of the loaded page. But before we do that, we'll have to move back to the server side first. Because it's good that we try to parse some JSON data here when we send a request to this URL or to this path. But at the moment, this would fail, because at the moment, if we have a look at our routes, this GET route here, to which we're sending a request, does not return any JSON. Instead, this GET route returns a rendered template, and therefore in the end some HTML code. Which was great as long as the browser should handle this, but which is not what we want now that we're sending our own request. Now we're not interested in a full HTML document. We don't want a rendered template. We want the raw data so that we can use that in our own client-side JavaScript code. And therefore now we want to change the response that's sent back here in this GET route. Instead of sending back a rendered template, we want to call the JSON method on the response object here in our Node Express code. And the JSON method is a built-in method on this response object, just as render was a built-in method. Render was a built-in method for rendering templates. JSON is a built-in method for sending back JSON data. And this can be confusing because we got a JSON method here in our Node.js Express code, and we got a JSON method here in our client-side JavaScript code. But the two methods are coming from totally different places. Here in the client-side JavaScript code, it's built into the browser. Here on the server-side code, it's built into the Express library. And they do different things. Here, when we call it on the server side, we in the end encode data as JSON to send it back as a response. On the client side, we do the opposite. We decode data, which is currently encoded in JSON, to convert it back into JavaScript data values with which we can work in our JavaScript code here. So we got the two opposite sides working together here between request and response. And therefore here we now want to send back a response where we encode our data as JSON so that we can then decode and use it here in our client-side code with help of that JSON method. Because JSON is that data format, that machine-readable data format, which is typically used for transmitting data between client and server. Now the JSON method here in our server-side Node Express code wants a value that should be encoded to JSON and that should then be sent back as the response data. And in my case here, that should be the comments. The comments which I fetched here, this array of comments, that's what I want to send back. We could also send back an object that has a comments key, which then stores the comments. So then the comments array would be a nested array in this object. This is totally up to you. You can wrap the array in such an extra object, or you directly send back the comments array, which is what I'll do here, but ultimately that is totally up to you. What we now don't need anymore here in our server-side route is this line here, line 119. Previously, I needed to fetch the post in addition to the comments because I had to render the complete post detail template. Now, since we don't load a new page but only send back specific data that we want on the front end, we don't need to get the post again. Instead, we just need to send back that specific data that was requested. And the specific data that was requested were these comments. So sending back the comments is all we need to do. And therefore now with that, we updated this server-side route. Now back on the front end, we get this response data, and parsing this from the JSON data should now work because we are now getting JSON data in the response. Now before we do anything useful with it, let's simply console log this response data here to see whether that all works. So now after adding all this code, if we now save all our files on the server and on the client, all we have to do is go back to the post detail template and there make sure that we load our JavaScript file. So here in the head section, we can add a script tag and point at /scripts/comments.js and also add the defer attribute to make sure that this file only executes once all the HTML code has been parsed. Now save this as well. And then back here, we can go back to all posts and view a single post. And now let's open the developer tools and go to the JavaScript console there to then click load comments. And if everything works, you should now see your array of comments here. So the comments that were fetched from the server side. And there they were fetched from the database. Now, of course, you might not have any comments yet. You have to add them through this form first, and you can do that even though the form is not implemented with Ajax yet. Still, it works, so you can add some comments. And once you did add some comments, you should also see them here in the console whenever you click load comments. Because sending this behind-the-scenes JavaScript request works. And you can tell that the page wasn't reloaded if you take a closer look at this refresh icon here. When you reload the page, or if you switch a page, it briefly changes to a cross. It's very quick, but it briefly flickers and changes to a cross. Here, if I click load comments, if you watch this icon, it never flickers. It never changes to a cross because this page never is reloaded. The browser is not loading any new page. This is really just happening behind the scenes, driven by our own JavaScript code, where we use this Ajax concept to send our own request. And that is a huge step forward. Now let's, however, also see how we can update what we see on the screen based on that response that we get back.